Hey everyone, it's Jeff Young, kinesiologist, and the purpose of this video is to explain how to design resistance training programs for both general and special populations using a concept called linear periodization. This is mostly a bird's eye view, but it is a way of explaining that periodization isn't just for athletes. The concepts and principles definitely apply to the general public as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I'll start off by saying that I always break down program design into two categories: the initial program design, which I call the familiarization phase, and then how you're going to progress out of the initial program design. And no matter what the individual's frequency, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 days a week, which with the general and special populations is pretty much always 2 days a week that they'll start with, occasionally 3 days. But that part doesn't really matter a whole lot, because no matter what the frequency, in the initial familiarization phase, I'm always going to start clients with the same general volume and intensity. And that's the purpose of the two charts within this instructional video, to go over them and give a little bit more clarity as to what periodization means for most of the general and most special populations. So beginning with the initial program design or the familiarization phase. Although I don't have it as a bullet point on this chart, from a volume standpoint, or in other words, sets per muscle group per session, I always look at it as I have a new body being placed in front of me. I need to take the time to get to know it, and I want to keep the volume low as one of the ways to keep things safe so that I can make sure their body is responding well to the initial sessions before I begin progressing them. And typically, what that means is that I'm not really going to have them perform more than 2 exercises per muscle group within the scope of a session. And I'll go over that in more detail in another related video. But the purpose of this one is mainly just to go over the general concepts and guidelines for periodization to set the overall picture and foundation before I begin to give it more clarity. So when it comes to repetitions per set, with nearly everyone, I start them at about 10 repetitions per set. And my reasoning is because it's right in the middle of that 6 to 15 repetition range, which is defined by the ACSM and NSCA, the two governing bodies in exercise science, as the repetition range for the general population to increase strength fitness. I don't really like to start clients with too high of repetitions per set, such as 12 or 15, because even though the loads are light, there is still going to be metabolic fatigue that's accumulated during the course of the set. And much of the general population is coming into their initial sessions being on the low level of strength fitness, or in other words, weak, and deconditioned as well. So their body isn't really set up to tolerate that type of metabolic fatigue. And because I want them to experience success, gain my trust, and really stay mostly within their comfort zone, at least for the initial sessions, I prefer to keep their reps more in that middle range. So 10 is the norm for nearly everyone. I won't go higher, and on occasion I will go lower, like starting them at 6 to 8 repetitions per set, but I'll really only do that if the person is very deconditioned, where performing 10 repetitions in a set would be very fatiguing for them, even with light loads. So in any case, the purpose of the familiarization phase is to first determine their available pain-free range of motion, which partially occurs just by speaking with them in the initial consultation and learning about whatever musculoskeletal conditions or joint pain they might have, so that you can take that into consideration before you even see them move on the gym floor. And then another major thing that goes into the equation for determining their available pain-free range of motion is beginning with a joint range of motion assessment at every major joint as part of my initial assessment. It's actually the very first thing I do after the initial consultation, so that I can get a strong sense of how freely their joints move through their ranges, once again, before even seeing them move on the gym floor and beginning to perform things like squats or rows or presses or any other type of exercise. And then other purposes for the initial program design are to teach them the names of exercises, proper form, the flow of a session, such as when and how to perform trigger point release, various dynamic warm-up exercises, and the purpose behind them, and then the actual workout itself. And then I use RPE scales, or more specifically, what I call the RPE method, to determine their initial loads. And this is where, by using this method, I choose loads that on a 1 to 10 scale, where the 7 to 10 range is a true working set, I actually choose loads that keep them to somewhere around a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, because I want the sets to feel on the heavier end of a warm-up. And this is because it's much more important to make sure their body is responding properly, that they aren't overly sore, and they're not experiencing any exacerbations or joint pain from these initial sessions, because it's so much more important to use this time and to ensure that they're staying within their available pain-free range of motion. But during the course of the familiarization phase, I will begin to start increasing their RPE, which means taking them a little bit closer to muscle failure. And more specifically, as an example, what I'll do is for the first week or two, I'll keep them at about a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. And when they return from session to session, and I find out from them how their body has responded to the previous session, and if I'm doing my job right, they're responding by saying, yes, my soreness was little to none, and I had no joint pain. Everything felt great. I'm definitely ready to move forward. Then I'll go another approximately 2-week block where I'll take them up to a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10, which still is technically a warm-up, but now it's on that cusp of being just shy of a true working set. So after keeping them there for about a 2-week phase and ensuring that their body responded properly, during which time they're now starting to become much more familiar with the names of exercises, flow of a session, the proper form for the exercises that I'm having them perform, and the fact that I'm using verbal, visual, and tactile cueing to help establish mind-muscle connections. I'll then increase them to about a 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, which is now a true working set where the velocity of movement at the very last repetition of the set for each of their working sets is now just starting to slow. And once they get to that point where they're now starting to perform true working sets and they've shown proficiency in movement, and where their soreness is little to none and they're recovering well from each session, they're now officially ready to leave this initial familiarization phase and enter the world of linear periodization where they begin progressing. So for some clients, this initial phase can take as little as 3 or 4 weeks. For others, it can take longer than that. Ultimately, what it depends on is their learning curve. Typically, those who do have some previous gym training have a smaller learning curve and can learn the exercises and the flow of a session much more quickly. And also those who come into it a little bit higher on the fitness level are going to recover more quickly, and I'll be able to move them through these RPEs more quickly and closer to muscle failure so that it doesn't take too long before we're forming true working sets. But in any case, those are the characteristics that determine the distinction between when you're in the familiarization phase and when you're ready to leave it and begin periodization. And then once we begin periodization, the reason why I put them on a linear program to begin with, no matter who it is, rather than a nonlinear program, is because I want to see how their body is responding to each repetition range individually, and I want them to experience how their body is responding to each repetition individually, rather than moving them from one repetition range to another, from session to session, or from week to week. So what I'll typically do is move them from that 10 repetition range where they started at up to the 12 to 15 repetition range. I'll keep them there for approximately 3 weeks, 4 at the most. Continue to educate them, continue to work on proper form, ensure they're staying compliant with their flexibility program that I place them on and the trigger point release. But the primary purpose of the phase is to make sure that by week 3 or 4, however long the phase is, they're a little bit stronger with each exercise they're performing as compared with week 1. And the reason why is, even though there's other things I could manipulate, such as rest periods in between sets, as a way to increase their overall conditioning, I personally will start to worry about those things later, because I just know through experience and basic exercise science that just by increasing their strength within each repetition range is going to optimize the adaptations that you would expect from each repetition range. And in this case, in the 12 to 15 rep range, what we're looking for is to increase local muscle endurance, which is also known as strength endurance, overall conditioning, and their work capacity. And what this 3 to 4 week phase does is it prepares both their mind and their body for when we move into the next phase, which is by dropping 2 reps back down into the 10 to 12 repetition range. We stay there for about a 3 to 4 week phase, increase the weight accordingly, slightly adjust the rest periods between sets to being just a little bit longer, because now on the strength and endurance continuum, they're beginning to slowly move away from local muscle endurance and towards strength. And just like the previous phase, while there's other variables I could adjust in order to maximize their strength endurance and lean muscle tissue, one of the primary things I'm thinking about is that by the end of the phase, whether it was 3 or 4 weeks, I want them to be a little bit stronger in each exercise than they were in the beginning, which then prepares their mind and their body to drop 2 more repetitions into the 8 to 10 range, which is now working with what would be considered moderate weights. And then I'll just do the exact same thing. Stay there for about a 3 to 4 week phase, increase the loads they're lifting during the course of the phase so that they're a little bit stronger at the end than they were in the beginning. And also by now, another thing that I'm doing is I'm starting to think about and ensure that the intensity of each exercise is beginning to ebb and flow. This is actually a critical concept to think about because you don't always want every session to be in the same proximity to muscle failure, or in other words, to be at the same level RPE. You want some sessions to be a little harder, which means taking sets just a little bit closer to muscle failure so that you're terminating sets where you're 1, 2, or 3 repetitions shy of muscle failure, depending on the client and their conditions and their fitness level. And other sessions that are a little bit lighter in intensity, where you're terminating sets just a little bit further away from muscle failure, such as a 3, 4, or maybe 5 repetitions shy of muscle failure. The adjustment you're making between a 7 and an 8 or a 7.5 and an 8.5 on a 1 to 10 RPE scale is small, but it makes all the difference in the world for both the mind, the body, as well as the program as a whole. So please keep in mind that you don't always want to go hard, hard, hard. You don't always want to go light, light, light. You want to ebb and flow between the two and make sure there's a method to the madness. And then whether I drop down to 6 to 8 repetitions per set is an executive decision based on conversations with the client themselves and what they would like to do, but also based on my experience, as well as the way their body has responded to the 3 previous phases. But the truth is, with most clients, even those who suffer from disease or musculoskeletal conditions, can train in the 6 to 8 repetition range. And a primary reason why is because we're not taking them to muscle failure. So these are not true 6 to 8 repetition maximum sets. You're leaving 1, 2, or maybe 3 repetitions in the tank at the end of a set. So the sets are sub-max. And once again, you can always adjust how close you take the individual to muscle failure. For instance, by terminating the set right when you begin to see the velocity of movement slow. And because they've already been through the familiarization phase and they've already started to develop a nice baseline level of fitness because they've spent 3 to 4 weeks at the 12 to 15, 10 to 12, and 8 to 10 repetition ranges, by the time they get to the 6 to 8 repetition range, in most cases, both the body and the mind are already prepared to drop just 2 more repetitions, and then the coach can adjust within that range how close he or she wants to take them to muscle failure. But because the sweet spot for most of your musculoskeletal, bone, and nervous system adaptations occur in the lower rep ranges with heavier weights, it's always in the front of my mind to try to take the client as low as I can safely go with them as soon as I'm able to do it. So for some people, this is going to mean that I do immediately move from the 8 to 10 repetition range down to the 6 to 8 repetition range. But if for whatever reason it's determined that they're not ready for it, then what I'll do is swing them back up to 12 to 15 reps per set and cycle through this again. What'll happen, whether you graph it or just by looking at previous training logs, you'll clearly see that the second time around, they're stronger and more fit in the 12 to 15 range as compared with the first time they went through it. And then the same will occur in both the 10 to 12 and 8 to 10 ranges. And for many clients at this point, it's like they're on steroids. And as long as they're consistent and putting in the effort and the sets are true working sets, you'll really start to see their strength, fitness, overall conditioning, and most of the time their health significantly improving. With my more able-bodied clients, I'll many times shift their repetition range from the 6 to 15 down to the 4 to 12 after they've cycled through the 6 to 15 repetition range in a linear fashion once or typically twice, which usually means by the time I shift them down to the 4 to 12 repetition range, at least 3.5 or 4 months, and many times about 7 months have gone by. So they've really developed a nice baseline level of fitness, and they're more than ready to progress to slightly heavier weights. It doesn't mean that I'll neglect the 12 to 15 range. I'll still throw that in there on occasion. But for general fitness, they're still going to see their local muscle endurance or strength endurance gains and adaptations in the 10 to 12 repetition range. And I'd rather see them improve their overall conditioning via their aerobic program, which hopefully at this point would start to include some high intensity interval training. So that during the resistance training program, we're placing a little bit more emphasis on increasing their strength without completely avoiding the higher repetition ranges with heavier weights. So other than ensuring that on an RPE scale and proximity to muscle failure, they're now in the 7 to 8 and maybe the 7 to 9 RPE range, depending on their conditions and their level of fitness. And also making sure that we're ebbing and flowing with intensity so that some sessions are lighter and some sessions are heavier. Also within the scope of these different phases, I'm starting to increase their variety in exercise selection. I'm starting to increase their sets per muscle group, both per session and within the scope of a week. And I'm always keeping that 10 to 15 sets per large muscle group per week guideline in mind and educating them about it so that that is one of the overall goals. Because while they are going to see increases in their strength and overall fitness just by going through this linear periodized program, if their sets per muscle group per week are below 10, so for instance, if they're only training twice per week, and for legs, back, and chest, they're only getting in 3 sets per session, which means 6 total sets within the scope of a week, it's still going to be tough for them to really begin to maximize the benefits of the program and their overall potential. So besides cycling through these repetition ranges in a linear fashion, you also want to think about slowly increasing their sets per muscle group for the legs, back, and chest, the multi-joint compound movements such as squats, deadlifts, lunges, their rows, and their chest presses. That within the scope of a week, whether they're doing 2, 3, or 4 sessions, they're hitting at least 10 sets for those 3 large muscle groups. So that is the gist of how to set up a familiarization phase or the initial program design for pretty much everyone, and how to progress them out of the familiarization phase and place them on a linear periodized program. And then at some point, you can make the executive decision as to whether or not you want to stay on a linear program or if you want to move to a nonlinear program, which I'll explain in much more detail in another instructional video. But the truth is, you can stay on this type of program for years on end and still continue to progress. And lastly, these are concepts that I learned at Penn State, that I saw put in action when I was involved during my junior and senior years in what at the time was the longest strength and conditioning study that had ever been performed under the direction of the premier strength and conditioning researcher in the world, where the results were absolutely amazing, seeing the subjects double, triple, and in some cases even quadruple their strength and overall conditioning within the scope of about 6 months. And I've been using these concepts and placing clients on this type of periodized program for the last 25 years of my career at facilities like Duke University Medical Center, UCLA Medical Center, and Beth Israel and Mount Sinai Medical Centers in New York City, across a really wide spectrum of medical conditions, both disease and orthopedic issues. So while there are many ways to skin a cat, or many means to the same end, what I just described is a nice, simple, logical way and an evidence-based way to set up a resistance training program. So hopefully you found that information to be mostly common sense. And in future videos, I'll break these concepts down further to give them even more clarity, to include each individual phase, and also for various musculoskeletal conditions and diseases. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.